It's really an honor to be here. And thank you for a very generous introduction. I'll pick up your most puzzling and mysterious question first before I do anything else. And you said, what's the connection between the job that I do and this book? And well, the job I do right now is I work for Directorate of Revenue Intelligence. It wasn't the job I was doing when perhaps I was traveling in those regions, which has predominantly happened between 2009 to 15. 9 because it started with a journey to the Kailash Mansarovar as a liaison officer of the Ministry of External Affairs. And that was a trek, alongside the river Kali on the northeastern borders of Pithoragarh, India and Nepal, and eventually the border with China, Tibet. So places like Lipu Lake Pass at 5,200 meters. I was working in Ministry of Finance at that point of time. And 3 years I was a diplomat in Hong Kong. So that's for sure helped in navigating this particular book, but not that the book was born at the beginning of that assignment. But we'll come back to that later. So the most obvious connection is, it's a book which seeks truth. Which seeks truth. As the learned Honorable Vice President of India, Mr. Venkaiah Naidu, recently wrote an article, probably in Indian Express, that, for 1,000 years, the last 1,000 years, Indian history has had so much of turbulence. I mean, starting with the attacks of Muhammad Ghori Ghaznavi, more than 17-20 attacks around the 11th century, 1000 turn of the second millennium. And then, of course, we had the slave dynasty, the Khiljis, Lodhis, the Mughals, and of course, the British. So the ancient Indian civilization, which flourished starting from 200, 600 BC, if I may say, the year in which Buddha was born, right up to 1000 AD, when we saw flourishing of art, architecture, the spiritual science, we saw invention of zero, we saw medicine, surgery, we dominated the world GDP with 20-25%. The book is an endeavor to seek the truth of that existence as it manifested in East Asia through the spread of philosophy, art, religion primarily. And so therefore in DRI, we are seeking truth as well. We are based on the 3 I call it the I cube of intelligence, integrity, and industriousness. I think I've used those 3 I's to produce this book as well. So without further ado, I will endeavor to show some glimpses of this book through a PowerPoint presentation. And it's a lockdown day indeed. And I have tried to keep most of the photographs, and there are 330 photographs used in the book. And the book is essentially in the form of a travelogue, which covers close to 100 destinations. Well, to be precise, like Chetan Chauhan and Shrikant, who lost out in centuries, as we all know, we've been reading recently, late Chetan Chauhan. So the book has 98 destinations, covering about 35, 37 places, which are spread over the East Asian region. So without further ado, I've used pictures other than book mostly, so that the curiosity of the listeners when they open the book remains unwetted and intact. First chapter, the book is divided into 6 chapters. Which the first one is called Camel Bells Along the Silk Road. So this journey along the Silk Road starts from a place called Luoyang. And Luoyang, China, like India, has had several ancient capitals. Luoyang was also one such capital, particularly in the first half of the first millennium. And from there, we moved to, of course, Shaolin, the famous Kung Fu temple is nearby. We moved to Xi'an and then onwards to Dunhuang. And Dunhuang at one point marked the westernmost borders of China, say about 1700, 1500 years back. And then we entered the territory of the Chinese province, as it is called today, of Xinjiang. It's also called as Chinese Turkestan, and which has these 3 fascinating places called Turfan or Turpan, Urumqi, it's pronounced as Urumqi, written as Urumqi, and then of course the famous Kashgar, which was once probably named as Kashi. It's still called Kashi and is not dissimilar to the Kashi of Varanasi. And the little monk that you're seeing below the Silk Road is none other than Huanshan, or Xuanzang as he's called in China. Let's start the journey. As it happens, the year is 8067, and the Chinese emperor of what is called as the Eastern Han Dynasty, Qin Shi Huangdi, sees a dream, and he dreams of this golden angel flying across. And he wakes up next morning and summons his ministers, courtiers. What was it that I dreamt of? And they say, hey, sir, your lordship, we know there is one Lord Buddha, angel in the west. Get me more information is what he says. And off go the Chinese envoys in search of knowledge, in search of Buddhism, in search of religion, and they succeed in making two Indian scholars, Buddhist scholars called Dharmratna and Kassapa Matanga, agree to come with them to China, to the royal court. And in this picture, you see them along with white horses, and you can see a little idol of Buddha, perhaps, seated on top of one of the white horses. Please notice their clearly distinct Indian eyes, the beard of the two monks, and notice also the Chinese gentleman who is holding the string, who is escorting, who is the pilot, the envoy. And these two gentlemen actually originated, they moved from Fargana, modern-day Uzbekistan. And so Babur is not the only link between Uzbekistan and India. This entire region of Central Asia was Buddhist as well. Buddhism, in fact, went right up to Persia, right up to, in fact, parts of Greece. In fact, the modern face of Buddha has this European hair. It's not common to an Indian, right? So these are Greek hair. So this developed during the Bactrian kingdom, when the Greek and the Indian art merged and formed what is called as Gandhara. But that's another subject. So these two gentlemen come, and they come to Luoyang, where the emperor is. And the emperor builds, initially they stay for 1 year in a steep guest house. And then he builds a special temple, which is called the Temple of White Horse. And incidentally, the Dr. Lokesh Chandra, Padma Bhushan, who has written the foreword to the book, has beautifully also explained that horses were high-speed galloping horses which the Chinese needed for defense and for military purposes. And these scholars were the Buddhist monks like Dharmratna, Kassapa Matanga, or Bodhidharma later on, were very well versed in martial arts as well. So along with Buddhism, along with horses came the martial arts as well. And here you see this little girl in Luoyang Museum welcoming them. Incidentally, I'll go back quickly. They died there. They were buried there. And these two scholars, Dhanratna, Kassapa Matanga, their tombs are there, as you can see on top right. And when we visited the place, their images were spread all over the temple. And it appeared as if they must have been contemporaries of Gandhi. It looked that fresh, only 2,000 years in time. One of the most fabulous grottos, and there are a series of these grottos and caves and temples in China. These are 1,500-year-old grottos called the Longmen grottos or Longmen caves. Now, the word long means dragon. And these are very near Luoyang. And the striking feature is the central Buddha, as you notice, the tallest one, and has a smiling countenance. And it's called as Rosana. Rosana, and that in Sanskrit means the Buddha emitting light, radiance, And from there, as Dr. Lokesh Chandra says, came the word Rosana Roshan Lal. So Roshan Lal is a common name here. But another interesting story about this Losan Buddha of Longmen Grottos is that the Empress Wu Zetian, the only empress in whole of China ever to have ruled from the very famous Tang dynasty, heavily patronized Buddhism. In fact, she took recourse to one sutra called Dayungjian Sutra. And in that sutra, which had an Indian version as well, that originated in South India. Along the Krishna River, it spoke of the rule of a queen. And so she found, the women can become rulers as well. So she heavily patronized Buddhism. And there was a great scholar called Yi Jing, who came back after returning with sutras from India to a rousing reception. The empress came out and greeted Yi Jing. The year was around 707. And so this Buddha, they say, resembles Wu Zetian. And so she derived political mileage and consolidated her power and position. There are a series of such caves, many of which have been devastated by the Cultural Revolution of 60s in China. But many like these magnificent ones survive. Well, there comes Rudra, you mentioned, Bodhidharma. Now, Bodhidharma is credited and associated with the Shaolin Temple, the world-famous center for Kung Fu. But interestingly, not many know its origins are in the Kalari Payettu. As you can see the image on the left, that is Kalari Payettu martial arts in Kerala. And on the top is a performance by was privy to. And on the right is this wise-looking gentleman, you can see, who was a prince in the Pallava dynasty from Kanchipuram, who decided to give up the royal life and power and instead undertook spirituality, became a learned man, and became the first patriarch, the first founder of what is called as Zen Buddhism later on in Japan. In China, it was called Chan Buddhism. And in India, the word Chan comes from Dhyan, means meditation. And Zen is a distortion of Chan. And the idea of this form of Buddhism was that you don't have to read scriptures, you don't have to read 100,000 books, including the book A Journey to the East on the Trail of Buddha, to become a learned man. You can achieve enlightenment purely by meditation. It is something which Vedanta, Advaita philosophy also talks about. It's something which is one of the main ingredients of the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. Anyways, he's called also as a wall-gazing Brahmin in China. He meditated in a cave for 9 years. And in fact, they say once he fell a little asleep and he was very upset with himself, so he cut off his eyelids. Another story goes that, the tea drinking culture in China started because he wanted to stay awake all the time. Because meditation is like wakefulness. So though your eyes may be closed, but you're highly alert. But I'll leave that, that's another subject. We come to the very famous place in China called Xi'an. And this place is famous, of course, for the terracotta warriors which were found buried under the ground, but is also very, very famous in China for this beautiful stone pagoda, which is called as Dayentha in Chinese, or in English it's called as the Big Wild Goose Pagoda. Now, this was the pagoda built by the emperor to commemorate the return of Huin Shan, the famous Chinese traveler, who returned to China back in Xi'an in 645. He traveled for 17 years throughout China, Huin Shan or Xuanzang, from 628 to 645. And in fact, he had to furtively leave Xi'an because he didn't have so-called passport. But he was determined to go and seek higher knowledge, spiritual knowledge from India. And he went through lots of hazards, and quite a few times he almost died, whether it were bandits, robbers, or whether it was crossing the very deadly Taklamakan desert in Xinjiang province, before Kashgar. That portion was the toughest portion. But he survived all that, and on the return, in India also he traveled all through India, from Gujarat to Kanchipuram to Kamrup, and many a times people on the way, the emperors of the kings of various states wanted him to stay there only. They offered their daughters in marriage. They, in fact, tried to guard him from leaving. So those very interesting challenges. And for those of you who want to read more about this, I do recommend a couple of books which are mentioned in my book also. First is called 10,000 Miles Without a Cloud by Sun Shu Jung. And the second is called Chasing the Monk's Shadow by Mishi Sharan. They're mentioned in my book in suggested readings. So this was built to commemorate. He then started translating sutras from Sanskrit to Chinese. He came back with a whole repository, a treasure trove, and established the Sutra Translation Institute. In Xi'an is a very famous pagoda dating back to 4th century, which is today called Famense. But in those days, when it was founded, it was called Ashoka's Pagoda. And in 1987, very, very interestingly, there was an accident. This pagoda that you see fell from the top, broke somewhere in the middle. And then to restore it, the Chinese government started digging deep in the ground. And they came across a whole treasure trove of more than 1,000 art crafts, Buddha's relics. As you can see, a little finger on the bottom left, which is basically Buddha's relic. There were caskets, there were precious objects, silver, gold objects. Now, what had happened was, which was lost to vagaries of time and history, these were relics sent by Ashoka, and they were found there. And during the most flourishing dynasty of China, as I mentioned, Tang dynasty, from 7th to 10th century, these relics would be taken out in a public procession from the temple right up to the streets of Xi'an. And this is, by the way, located about close to 60 to 100 kilometers off Xi'an. So they would be taken out, and the emperors and the royalty would give a lot of presents and gifts to the temple. They have now made a modern temple complex here. Now, moving further west to Dunhuang, and here you can see the caves. These go back to the 3rd and 4th century. This was a westernmost point on the Silk Road, and a monk who came here from the west side, India side, saw a halo and saw some sort of golden lights, and he thought this is a sacred place. But also there's a river flowing below, so it became a rendezvous place, a melting pot of cultures. You had the people living in the Xinjiang province were Sogdians, Tocharians, Caucasian, Mongoloid. You had some Chinese as well. So this became like a modern Hong Kong, Singapore, a melting cultural pot of ideas, religion, philosophy. And gradually these more than thousands of caves got built up. And this place is also famous for a cave called Cave Number 17, where a lot of explorers, because there are beautiful frescoes. I'm going to show you one of this, the famous Nirvana posture of Buddha. And this is the actual cave inside Dunhuang. And they keep many caves closed, only a few are open. And you can see the frescoes on the wall. So a lot of foreign explorers, and Peter Hopkirk talks about them in foreign devils on the Silk Road, like Sir Aurel Stein of British Hungarian descent, who actually moved from India, Paul Pilliard from France, Count Otani from Japan, and some Russians as well. They all came and they tried to scrap off these frescoes. There was a custodian, Wang Yang. They bought lots of frescoes and sculptures and sutras and manuscripts from him at dirt through prices. Well, that's another story. So moving further west, we have this place of Turfan. And near Turfan, we have two historic cities of Karakhoja and Yarkhoto, which were great Buddhist centers of learning. Karakhoja was in fact the capital of Xinjiang province. And there are caves like the Bezekli caves, where a lot of Buddhist frescoes were there, but which were again looted, so as to say, by the foreign devils on the Silk Road. But the people here are still very friendly people, very beautiful people. And you have some of the best fruits I've ever had in my life were in this area, Turfan Valley. You have the flaming mountains. And today, of course, from 14th century onwards, this area entirely became, there were attacks by people coming from Turkey side, from Middle East, and this became Islamic. But I would say people here are fairly secular in their day-to-day lifestyles, and you have to be with them for a while to feel it. The music is phenomenal. There is art as well. The ending of the Silk Road from the first leg of chapter happens with this place, as I said, Kashgar. And you can see Kashgar was a place which is even today, every Sunday you have this famous cattle market. So at one point of time, you had a double-humped Bactrian camel. You had all kinds of other animals being sold. Today, of course, you don't see the double-humped Bactrian camel as much, except I saw a solitary one. But you have a lot of other cattle, and people gather from all adjoining villages. And this was the place, the gateway to Karakoram Highway, which is there today, and the Karakoram Pass and the Kunjere Pass. So in fact, we also went further from Kashgar towards Kunjere Pass, and there's a beautiful high-altitude lake called Karakul Lake. And I thought, I rightly studied at IIT Delhi in a hostel called Karakoram Hostel when I traveled on this Karakoram Highway. Moving on to chapter 2, this is the north-south trading route from Beijing to Mongolia across the Gobi Desert. And this circuit starts from Beijing, and you can see this famous Tsongkhapa statue. Now, Beijing itself has a lot of Buddhist heritage. This Lama temple is a great example. This was patronized by the last dynasty, the Qings. In fact, this temple was actually the residence of one of the emperors when he was a prince, and then it was converted into monastery. This is a famous hanging temple near Taiyuan in the Shanxi province I mentioned. This temple has Buddhist elements as well as Confucian and as well as Taoist. Then this place is a very famous temple of Buddhism in China. It's one of the 4 most holy dhams of Buddhism in China, just like our 4 dhams of Badrinath, Sringeri, Dwarka, and Puri. Wu Taishan, Wu means 5 in China. So there are these hills and 5 set of hills in the valley of which this monastery is located. This had thousands of monks and nuns in its prime days. This also has the relics of Buddha sent by Ashoka. And this was set up for the first time in AD 68. It is said, Dr. Lokesh Chandra writes that, even Mao Zedong, before he took over as the Communist Party chief of the People's Republic of China on 1st of October 1949, just before that, though communism doesn't recognize any religion, he visited and paid his respects at Wu Taishan. Another startling feature is this is the only place which is mentioned in our Sanskrit text as a sacred Buddhist place, and that too in China. And these Sanskrit texts go back to 6th century. And notice also that this place is the place where they worship the Bodhisattva of Manjushri. Now, Manjushri is the Bodhisattva who cuts the cloak, the veil of Maya, and cuts through with like a sword, so that enlightenment comes and the transcendent wisdom comes to us. And on his left hand, in the right hand, Manjushri has the sword, and in the left hand is the Prajna Paramita Sutra. Now, not far away from this area is the famous Yungang grottos. Now, you recall seeing the famous Longmen grottos in chapter 1, and Yungang grottos were built before those Longmen grottos that you saw earlier on. Those were famously associated with the Tang dynasty, the ones I showed you before, with the great empress called Wu Zetian. But these were built in the 4th and the 5th centuries by a dynasty which again had its origins in Mongolia just like the Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan in 13th century, around 1278, set up the Yuan dynasty of China, right, with the capital as Beijing, which is also called as Khan Balik, the capital, the place where Khan lives. And Beijing, I'm just going back to Beijing. Bei means north, Jing means capital. So contrast that with Nanjing. Nan is south, and Jing again capital, where the famous massacre in the Second World War took place. But this capital was again founded by Mongolians, and the tribe is called Tuoba. So, and this was almost 700 years before Kublai Khan. So China has had its share of invasions, but this tribe was again Buddhist, heavily patronized. And these are magnificent grottos, but what's most famous and unique to them, if I may say, is the kind of statuary, the work that you see inside the caves. Now you saw Dunhuang again in chapter 1, in the Gansu on the wall, right? This one's more famous for the colored statuary. Of course, the colors that you see right now are not the original colors. They've been faded and redone at different points of time. The Longmen grottos, in contrast, are famous for the gigantic statues of Buddha. So moving on further now, this is as an example. Of course, Ajanta Ellora is the best example in terms of the cave art, but there's another beautiful example in India. In 2016, I visited, these are called the Alchi caves in Ladakh. They come under Likir Monastery. And see how the entrance to the temple is very much, cave temple is similar to what you saw in this slide. Notice on the left. And then, of course, the journey comes to Ulaanbaatar, and where you have the gigantic statue of Genghis Khan unveiled to celebrate 800 years of his coronation. It's a whole statue with a horse that you see in the top, center top, which is made of silver. And you have to take a lift to reach on the top. Now, Genghis Khan is generally known as, of course, the founder of the biggest empire in the world. But what is less known about Mongols is the fact that they established a very secular, egalitarian rule of law, which had codified law. They abolished capital punishment. So the Chinese and the Europeans also recall all those battles between Scotland and England, and people being put to death in a very torturous way on the Tower of London, for example. Or the Chinese would also brutally kill people. Mongols stopped all that. They made it very human. I mean, recall the debate that we still have on capital punishment of death, whether it should be there or not. Some countries don't have it, some have it. They established a large number of schools for the plebeian class. And in fact, Kublai Khan's regime, lakhs of schools came up. They established a lot of trading routes between Europe and Asia, and they were in fact responsible for the transfer of technology and exchange of best practices, most notably in the form of the magnetic compass, the printing press, the paper currency, and the gunpowder. And that in fact is the harbinger. And this all happened in 13th and 14th century. And this is the harbinger of Renaissance Europe. And for those of you who might be interested more to know about this, I strongly recommend a book called Making of the Modern Man, Genghis Khan by Jack Weatherford. It's mentioned in my book as suggested readings. In the bottom, you see is a war camp, a typical war camp, the way Genghis Khan would move. And sometimes these tents which you see are actually also called as yurts. And they would be put on a chariot, and whole tents would move as it is. And the Mongols would not need much food. They could travel on horses for 10 days at a stretch. They would have dried milk, and they would add water to it and would become a drink, dried yogurt. Even they would carry the flesh. They would kill their own horses and beat the flesh, the meat against the saddle and make it soft and eat. And that is what gave them immense amount of mobility and striking power. On the top left, you see a very interesting Uyghur couple from the Chinese Xinjiang province I mentioned earlier on. And these Uyghurs were also in the Mongolian army and in the service of the Mongol emperor. And in fact, they were called bhikshus, and they were all Buddhists. So as Mr. Lokesh Chandra says in the foreword, they were the first ones to introduce Buddhism in Mongolia. But what is more well-recorded incident of introduction of Buddhism in Mongolia is one of their descendants of Genghis Khan called Altan Khan. He invited Sonam Gyatso, the famous Lama from Tibet. And under his influence, he became fully Buddhist. And he gave the title of the Lai. The means big, Lai means a Lama. Lai means ocean. So an ocean of wisdom. and he was anointed as Dalai Lama number 3, Sonam Gyatso. And the earlier 2 Dalai Lamas were like Song Khapa and one more. And of course, Altan Khan later himself was anointed as a Dalai Lama. We move to chapter 3, which is Sichuan, and from Sichuan to the roof of the world. So we'll start with this iconic World Heritage site. In fact, many of the places I've been showing are all World Heritage sites. I may not be mentioning them each time, but this is the iconic Da Pho. Now, Da again, as I said, means pig, and Pho means Buddha. And this is located in a place called Le Shan. This is not very far from Chengdu. And I've always wondered as a child, we would love the Chinese food, Szechuan, they call it, right, in the restaurants. But there's nothing called Szechuan in China. It's actually Sichuan. So it's a distortion of that. And 2 days back, I think around Thursday, Times of India carried a story where this Da Pho's was feet. The water, because of the floods, had come up to his feet. And typically, this was built in 7th century and took 90 years to build. And today, it is the world's highest Buddha, made as a rock cut, in the rock cut Buddha form, natural Buddha. This is about 70 meters or close to 240 odd feet high. And it's at the confluence of 3 rivers. I mean, imagine the amount of strategic planning that must have gone across 4 generations, because it took 90 years to complete that Buddha. Now, while much of these gigantic Buddhas have been destroyed in India, but I must point out that this particular little Buddha that you see is in a place called Mulbek in Ladakh, near Kargil, between the Kargil-Leh road. And the most famous example, and the world's highest Buddha, in fact, even bigger than Lashan, as you all know, was in Bamiyan in Afghanistan, which is not very far from Ladakh. But then it was destroyed in 2001 by Taliban's. Now, this is another place in Sichuan province. Now, this is a second dham, the second of the 4 dhams in China. This is called as Ermi Shan. Now, the word Shan, if it's confusing you, it simply means a mountain. And here they worship the Bodhisattva called as Samanta Bhadra in India. Samanta Bhadra, Bhadra is just like Bhadra Lok in Bengal, virtuous people. And Samanta is universal. So, Samanta Bhadra, who's called Puxian in China, symbolizes virtues, universal virtues, rightful action, truthful conduct. And notice the elephant on which this Bodhisattva is mounted is a mythical elephant with 6 tusks, 3 on the left and 3 on the right. And also please notice that as per the mythology and legend, Maya Devi, the mother of Buddha, when she was giving birth to him, it is said that in the same mythological elephant entered her breast, and hence was born Buddha in Lumbini. And in fact, I started my career close to Lumbini at Indo-Nepal border. This is, of course, I don't have to introduce this. This is the holy Kailash and the Manasarovar lake. Kailash in Tibetan is called Kang Rinpoche, or the snow jewel. There are not just the 4 major rivers which are born here, the Indus, the Satluj, the Karnali, breeds. Most of Southeast Asian civilizations of Vietnam and South China are also originating from this, as also the Yellow River. And of course, 4 religions worship the Kailasha. Apart from Hinduism, you have Buddhism, Jainism, and a pre-Buddhist religion in Tibet, which is called as the Bon religion. The bottom right image is the arduous trek, which I had. In fact, this is the first of the journeys in this book, which I had the privilege of undertaking as the liaison officer of the Kailash Manasarovar in 2009 July. So hence, therefore, I say it took me 11 years to produce this. Coming to the 4th chapter, leg of this journey is the region of southeastern China, the most prosperous, and is also Taiwan. So I cover places starting with Chanjiang, which is in Guangdong province, close to the Hainan Island, close to Hanoi, in fact. Moves on to Hong Kong, and from Hong Kong we move to Hangzhou, Suzhou, Nanjing, Shanghai, and then Taipei in the northmost part of Taiwan, and then Tainan. In fact, Tainan in the middle left of Taiwan was the ancient capital of Taiwan. And it is not the first time that Chiang Kai-shek in 1949, after losing the battle to the civil war to Mao Zedong, fled here, as we all know. But there was an incident of similar fleeing of royalty from the mainland China into Taiwan. And this happened around 17th century when the Ming dynasty was uprooted by, as I mentioned before, the Manchus who formed the Qing dynasty. So the last Ming ruler called Koxia, he escaped and he also came to Taiwan, and he established his headquarters in this place called Tainan. And therefore, Tainan today has a lot of Buddhist temples and Confucian temples as well, and a very strong climate. In fact, whole Taiwan, the amount of fervor, religious fervor that I saw was remarkable, and quite in contrast to the fervor that you see in China. Though even in China, the fervor has picked up, I believe, significantly after the days of the Cultural Revolution of 60s. The Taiwan leg ends with a beautiful place called Kaohsiung, which is a major port city, southmost point of Taiwan, as you see, which has some incredible monastery, which I'll show you hence. This, of course, is the modern skyline of Hong Kong. But Hong Kong, 50% area is national parks, and it has some beautiful Buddhist monasteries, and this remarkable statue of Buddha called Tiantian Buddha. Tiantian means sort of heavenly Buddha, is almost 35 meters high. It's entirely made up of bronze, and it was conceived as a project in 1993 when Hong Kong was still with the Britishers. And they sent the monks of the nearby monastery called Polin Monastery to a place in Japan called Kamakura, which I'll show you in the Japanese leg. And also they went to Leshan, recall the big Dafo in Sichuan. And inspired, they came back and they designed this. And this was commissioned in 1997, the year Hong Kong was handed over back to the Chinese. Hangzhou is again a very historic place which has been worshipped by even the founders of the Communist Party of China. And this place is, of course, famous for a gigantic lake called the Western Lake. It's an artificial lake, and it was formed to connect Beijing, north of China, with South China through a great canal, which is called as the Western Canal. And that canal itself is about 1,500 kilometers long and was declared a World Heritage Site, I guess, around 2015 or so. But apart from these travel remarkable, points of interest, from the Buddhist heritage point of view, is this famous mountain, which has these nice statues of rock-cut statues of Buddha. They aren't as big as the ones you've seen before, but in art form, in terms of fineness of work, they're very beautiful. And what's most striking is that the peak, this mountain is called Fe Lai Fai. Now, that's a Chinese name. Basically, it means the mountain that came flying from the west. And this actually refers to Griddhakuta, the Rajgir mountain, where most of the Buddhist sermons took place. The journey then moves to Shanghai and the famous lake and beautiful garden town of Suzhou. And I've deliberately, in fact, in this entire presentation, I'm showing you pictures which have not been used in the book, so that your curiosity remains intact when you see the book and you discover something new. The beautiful gardens of Suzhou and Shanghai, in fact, made them so famous that the administrators, painters, artists, all they flocked, as also beautiful women, as they say, the Chinese themselves say. But there's tremendous amount of Buddhist heritage as well. As you see this Gandhara art form Buddha on the right, which I saw in the Shanghai Museum. And there is this, the world's highest statue of Buddha, but it's artificial, unlike what we saw in Leshan, and that's called the Buddha of Wuji, which is not very far from this region. We move to Taipei, and as I mentioned, notice now the kind of fervor in the prayers by the people on the bottom right. And this is the famous temple of Longmingshan, or Longshan temple, and Long means dragon, and this is right in the heart of Taipei city, and this is next to a very interesting alley called the Snake Alley, and there you can have the snake soup and etc. Of course, that was beyond me to try, but you also notice on the bottom left, there's this girl who has thrown two pieces of wood, yin and yang, and they have this interesting superstition that, you know, the wood piece is shaped, it's flat on one side and rounded on the other side. So when you throw them after shaking them with a kind of a tormenting question in your mind, which you want the God to answer. So if both the sides as they fall are same, then if the answer means, for example, yes, and if they are uneven, it means perhaps no. This is Tainan, and you see the amount of, there are lots of these little temples as you see on the bottom left. And of course, to reach from Tainan, from Taipei, you have this fantastic bullet train, just like in Japan, Shinkansen, and also now in China you have the bullet trains. On the top right is a very beautiful musical instrument, which I was privileged to hear this young lady playing it at the fort of Koxia in Tainan. It's called as guqing, and that, in fact, when you hear some music and you say it's Chinese music, it's basically guqing. This is that famous monastery of Kaohsiung, and which was an ancient monastery as seen from the bottom left, but they've built a new complex, as you see in the top, and they have a fabulous museum. And on the bottom right, you see that vault which was found under that Ashokan pagoda of Famensa in Xi'an, which I mentioned when the pagoda broke in 1987 and then discovered the relics. So I first read about it in the museum in Taiwan. And as a series of fortunate circumstances would have had it, my visit to Xi'an happened in that very month. So I was absolutely thrilled. What was also remarkable in Kaohsiung is a series of paintings depicting the philosophy of Buddhism and the stories. And one painting I've mentioned here, reproduced, you see that Kusha grass story. The lady comes to Buddha mourning and wants Buddha to make his boy who has died alive again. And the Buddha says, all right, I will do that, but first you have to do me a favor. Please go to any household and get Kusha grass from such a household where there has not been a single death. So she goes from one house to the other, to the third, to the fourth, but she's not able to find such a house where there's not been death. She comes back and she has understood the lesson, and she realizes that whoever has come has to go, and she sort of is no longer mourning. There are many such beautiful stories depicted in this monastery pictorially, and you can't but fail to recognize the Indian origins in the characters which are on display there. We enter the land of morning calm, the Korean Republic, South Korea, which has, in fact, the Seoul capital itself has many monasteries, temples, and their main palaces also have a lot of Buddhist art, architecture. But this particular image, I'm showing you very few slides because the book has 98 such places. So this one in south of South Korea is near the town of Busan. It's called Gyeongmyosa. And it's a Buddhist temple which was again set up by a lot of these Korean monks. They traveled to China, just like the Chinese monks, they came to India. The Indian monks, apart from going to China, in fact, there's a recorded history of Indian monks coming to Korea as well. And there were these interesting dynasties called Shilla. And in fact, there is a very legendary story of the princess of Ayodhya marrying a Kim, royal a prince from the Korean dynasty more than 1,000 years back, 1,500 years back. And they say that 10% of Kims in Korea all have Indian origins. This monastery, I had the experience of drinking tea, because tea is offered as an offering to Buddha to begin with, and it's quite a different kind of tea ceremony than the way we have tea in India. This is again, all these are World Heritage sites. This is Bulguksa, and this is again in South Korea, more on the eastern coast. And has the famous Ashoka's lion capital. 4 of them were there, in fact. 3 have been destroyed with time, but 1 can still be seen. But the architecture was very interesting and quintessentially Korean. This is probably one of the most interesting places in Korea that I was able to visit. It's called Haeinsa, a World Heritage Site again. This has a distinction of having the oldest book ever printed on wood. And not on one single block. You see on the top left, I'm showing you some black colored slabs as sort of a library. And the letters are engraved on those blocks. And there are 84,000 such pieces of wooden blocks, about roughly 1.5, 2 feet long, 1 feet in height, and about 2 inches in width. And this entire sutra, which was written on these 84,000 blocks, is Prajna Paramita Sutra. And it has been stored in a naturally air-conditioned type of environment under the ground in the temples without any modern air conditioning facilities, which is a sort of air conditioning engineering marvel. And therefore, it was recognized, conferred as a World Heritage Site. And also, what is striking is that the hills around this temple, as I did a temple stay here, and it was a great experience. And morning, they said the hills are called Gaesan, and it sounded very Korean. But morning, I was reading a coffee table book there, and I found that Gaesan is actually named after Gaya. And San as in Japan, it means mountain. So Gaya-san is after the place where Buddha got enlightenment. And this is Seogguram, a famous grotto again in Korea. With this, we enter the last chapter of the book, The Land of Rising Sun. Japan has had not only the royalty, the capitals of the kings, but also a very interesting system of shoguns, or the military generalisimos, who wielded concurrent power. And there was often competition between the shoguns and the emperor in terms of who is a bigger patron of art and religious heritage, architecture, etc. But we'll come to that later. This is the famous World Heritage Site called the Golden Temple, or King Kakuji. Now, this is belongs to the Zen sect of Buddhism, which I mentioned earlier on. And there are very interesting stories about this most beautiful temple of Kyoto. It caught fire because of the stupidity of a monk somewhere in 1940s. For those of you who are interested, there's a beautiful film made on this as well. There are 16 to 17 World Heritage sites in Kyoto. Now, this is the iconic monastery of Kyoto. It's called the Kyomizu-dera. It's named after a water giving, sort of life source of a water outlet. Mizu probably means water, and there's a lot more. I'll leave it for you to discover in the book. Very beautiful as well. Now, this is the most famous Buddha of Japan. It's called the Buddha of Nara. And Nara was an ancient capital of Japan even before Kyoto. While Kyoto was the capital between roughly 775 up to 1860, Nara was the capital from close to 700 to 775 for 75 years, which is when this temple called Todai-ji, in which this is an entire wooden enclosure, in which this Buddha, which is made of bronze, of roughly 11 meters in height, is enclosed. And this was built by the emperor. But to formally inaugurate it, they invited a monk from India called Bodhisena. So he came here, and he was traveling at that point of time to Wutaishan, one of the 4 holy places in China. And he came here at the invitation of the emperor and, unveiled the eyelids. And by that symbolic act, the Buddha's statue was consecrated and inaugurated. But the city witnessed a pandemic, like the pandemic we are going through right now in around 775, plague. And a lot of people died. And obviously the emperor decided to change the capital, as they thought this capital is inauspicious. So it changed to Kyoto. And Nara also has a very interesting deer park, and just like the Sarna deer park. But I leave that. You might want to check in the book. This is a very famous place called Koyasan in the South Japan province of Wakayama. It's about roughly 4 hours of journey from Kyoto. And this is famous as the headquarters of Shingon school of Buddhism, which is basically the Vajrayana, or the tantric form of Buddhism. Now, it came here into this place, Koyasan, from none other place than Chang'an or Xi'an, we've been talking about in China. And where it was in turn, it come from India through 3 Indian monks called Vajrabodhi, Amoga Vajra, and Subhakarishma. And these 3 monks' photographs, I didn't show you that in the chapter 1, but they're all in the book. Their images are still there in Dashingshan Temple. And Honorable Prime Minister, when he visited, I mentioned 2014 Xi'an, he visited to this particular temple as well. There was a Japanese monk called Kukai, or Kobo Daishi. He was also a diplomat, a civil servant. He was commissioned by the emperor in around 800 AD to visit Chang'an, Xi'an, and learn about Buddhism. And he was commissioned to do so for 20 years. But he, being a smart, intelligent person, did it in 2 years and came back and established this place, the Shingon headquarters at Koyasan. We had the privilege of doing a very beautiful night stay for 2 nights in this temple with my family. And you notice this structure on the gravel. It's a Sanskrit character, hraha. Hraha means Vishnu. It also means Buddha with light. And the Japanese have put an inscription on the top. You see hraha. And they've given it the meaning that this means Buddha meditating in the middle of a lotus flower. And this temple is called as Renge Join. This is one of the 3 most beautiful sites of Japan. It's called the floating torii. The orange vermilion structure is a torii. And tories are found in Shinto shrines in Japan. Now, Shintoism is another type of religion which is more of nature worship. But the interesting thing is that in many temples, both Shintoism and Buddhism happily coexist. Of course, Buddhism was the dominant religion for much of Japanese history. But in modern times, they joke that they are born Shinto, the Japanese. They marry like a Christian, but they die like a Buddhist. And in fact, the previous place I showed you, they say that Kukai or Kobo Daishi in this Koyasan, the beautiful temple is Samadhi, where it is there. All that is there in the book, where he's still meditating. And if anybody in Japan dies, they always try to take some fragment of his body and put it next to that Samadhi of Kukai. So they feel that they'll be blessed by Kukai. And so Miyajima, near this also there are fascinating Buddhist temple where you can see Saraswati in her Japanese avatar. She's called Benzai Ten. This is the famous Buddha made of bronze of Kamakura. Kamakura was, one of the capitals, not of the royalty of Japan, but just shogun capital in the 13th, 14th century. And this structure goes back to 700 years. Of course, it's a World Heritage Site. And I now come to the famous three monkeys whom we identify: hear no evil, speak no evil, listen to no evil. Don't see evil. And these three monkeys are originally were not discovered by Gandhi, but they are very much an integral part of Buddhist philosophy, the Eightfold Path. And these are engraved and made on a temple in a place called Nikko. And I cover that place extensively. It's north of Tokyo. And a famous Japanese scholar called Fuji-san, around 1940s or 30s, he visited India, and Gandhiji met him. And Fuji-san told this, in fact, Mr. Lokesh Chandra has mentioned about this incident, and there's a reason for that. He mentioned about these three monkeys to Gandhiji. Gandhiji then consulted Dr. Raghuveera, the famous Indologist, who incidentally was father of Mr. Lokesh Chandra. Are the monkeys all right in Hindu mythology? Are they sort of considered sacred, holy? So he says, of course they are. Recall the Hanuman. And then Gandhiji popularized them as part of the non-violent action plan. And I must mention here, I told you about the Chinese monkey of Sun Wukong, who's like Hanuman, like Monkey King, who accompanies the Huanshan's character in the journey to India. Japan also has lots of very exciting festivals called Matsuris, because the book at the end of the day is basically a travelogue. So there's a lot of cultural exchange about the people. So I remember waking up in this place called Takayama to the sounds of, we were lucky because it was Sakura time, springtime. And the whole Japan, as we kept moving, it was like we were trying to chase the Sakura. And so the Matsuris were on at different places, and in the chariots you see musical instruments. You see the gentleman playing the flute. There are young girls playing a stringed instrument called shamisen, and then there's somebody, young kids are on the drums. And so we joined these festivities. I rushed with my camera out one fine morning as I heard these exciting sounds, and they were very generous and hospitable, and they offered a holy drink. And I took it, and it was alcoholic. So it was actually sake. And instead of a tea, you started to drink. Finally, I come to the last slide. So making of the book. So on the top left is a gentleman who was playing a beautiful gucheng musical instrument in Beijing and Summer Palace. And when he saw me, he was playing a music which I identified, which is called Butterfly Lover's Concerto, a fine piece of Chinese classical music. And I started humming because I'd heard that before. And when he saw me, he started playing Awara Hoon, the Indian melody of 60s. On the top right is Hangzhou. But on the stone, you see the image of a monk who is none other than Xuanzang or Huanshan. On the bottom is that tea ceremony concluding in Byomyosa temple in Korea. On the top left, you see near that gigantic silver statue of Genghis Khan, there is a Mongol on my left, and there is a Kazakh gentleman on my right. And of course, they have the sport of the eagles and looking for going with blindfolded, and they sort of hear the sound and they hunt the cattle, the fowl, and then the Mongols would follow on the horses. On the top right is again the Matsuri, the festival. And on the bottom is the picture of my Kailash Mansarovar Yatri delegates, whom I had the privilege of leading as a liaison officer back in 2009. I thank you very much for joining today and for giving me a patient hearing. Over to you, Mr. Kapur.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deepankar ji. It's a great pleasure to hear you. And this is to whet our appetites so that we can definitely have a look at the book and buy it. And it's amazing that you have traveled so much and you have managed to put in so much in the space of how many, 6 years?
Well, 6 years of travel and 5 years of production, so it's 11 years in all.
Yeah, but 6 years you traveled all these various exotic places. That is an amazing experience. I'm sure you must have had a major, what would you say, personal development through all this exposure.
Absolutely. I thought you were going to say I picked up fight with my family because I was outside. Many of these journeys have been undertaken. Some with the family, of course. But yes, you're right. At the end of all these journeys, and I couldn't show all the places I possibly couldn't have each chapter, as I said, there are close to 100 places, and each place has so many stories. But in the entire process of 11 years, I think it has transformed me willy-nilly, consciously, unconsciously. And as I reflect, especially in the times in which we are now, COVID times, we all have to look inwards. And the message of Buddhism or of Vedanta, of oneness, of universality, or I would say in Aftam Saka sect of Buddhism, they call it, which was a major proponent of whom was Nagarjuna. They call it Shunyata. Now, Shunyata, because we all, eventually are so interconnected with everybody else. I mean, no better example than a COVID virus, from Wuhan to all over the world. I mean, we're all so very, very intricately interconnected, but we don't realize it. So normally our world is confined to our family or our material goals. I mean, I'm talking from a common man's perspective. But this message of oneness, and therefore is so very relevant, which is astounding, and which should therefore make us realize that whatever we do, like the Gandhiji's talisman, should be for the benefit of the poor man, of the weakest link of the society, and not just all states of our country, or not just all countries of the world today, but all sentient beings, all flora, fauna, all of us are part of the same life force, and we have to therefore respect the environment as well. I mean, look at what's happening in California. You have the wildfires, you have 54 degrees Celsius, you had the bushfires in Australia. I mean, you have so many glaring examples of climate change. So we are all so very interconnected. Yes, it has had an impact on me as well, for sure.
But it was a fascinating rendition. I think personally I have learned something new, and I look forward to going through the book first.
One question which I had, in China, I have traveled a little bit in China also, but religion as such has been suppressed over there for generations now. 70 years, maybe more. But this practice of Buddhism, you have seen it reviving?
So, the answer to that question will be yes. You see, they did cultural revolution of 60s, where the red guards of the Communist Party of China will go around and destroy statues, will harass the monks in the monasteries, and so on and so forth. But people at the very core, because Buddhism has been there for 2,000 years, right? So they are still Buddhist. In my personal interactions with some of the government officials in China, I have found secretly they will never say they're Buddhist, right? But like I was, moving out of my diplomatic assignment. So one person came to me and gave me a Chinese fan. And on that fan, there were sutras, sutras which Huin Shan had got from India. And in the middle of one of the sutras, he wrote my name, Aron. And if I asked him, are you Buddhist? At some point of time in the past, he simply didn't answer the question. Because they're so mortally scared, of the Communist Party. Officially. And then I remember another Chinese coming to Jaipur for an international event, and he, requested me, if he could have some incense, Indian incense, considered very sacred, holy. So these are just two examples, but my sense is that even the government has realized that, if they completely do away, shut down with temples, monasteries, that's going to backfire. Because public dissent, is something which they don't want. And then, there have been attempts of Christianity or Islam also taking roots in China, and they find Buddhist is a far better religion in terms of challenge to the state authority. So they have therefore allowed opening of the monastery starting with 1979. And around that time, when Deng Xiaoping came, then they started liberalizing and reopening these places. Of course, they're still very tightly controlled. The monks there, the priests and all would be state appointed. And they would know exactly who is coming, what is happening. But privately, people, I feel, are strongly Buddhist by their belief, especially even the young generation, because Chinese have this great tradition of, the baton moving from one senior generation to the next. So it's not that those who have been born, say, after 1960s, post-cultural revolution would be purely materialistic, though of course that also is there with their progress. But I feel they very much, and this is a kind of persecution has happened in the past also more than once. Multiple times it's happened in China. Each time Buddhism has sprung back.
Uh-huh. But the temples and all that, they are maintained by the state. And one did not really find queues of people lining up to go and pray over there. That I did not really see.
It's lesser compared to, say, places in Taiwan, as I mentioned.
Taiwan, yes. Taiwan, I saw quite a few. Korea I have not been. Japan also, there's a lot of religion thing.
Yes, but I would say there's a revival. The numbers are increasing. Some out of as tourists. Of course, you see more elderly people in these places in China.
Correct.
But slowly, I think it's increasing.
I just wanted to say that it's very lovely, and we have visited those Alchi and that other Buddha he showed in Ladakh. So I know it's very beautiful, especially Alchi. It was an experience.
So yes, Alchi, in fact, dates back to roughly 1,000 years old in time. And But the kind of work you will see preserved in China, despite the cultural revolution and the sort of desecration of some of the sites, is still much more grander. Because India for the last 1,000 years we've had so many attacks. I mean, the slave dynasty, the Khiljis, the Tughlaqs, Mughals, and all of them went after anything which is like an idol or a statue or a But even before, of course, after Shankaracharya's revival of Hinduism, even then this battle between so-called Buddhism and Hinduism started. And they say that some of these holy shrines, Badrinath and Kedarnath were all Buddhist originally, you see. So they've been reconverted back into Hinduism. So therefore, Dunhuang caves would be far more spectacular than Alchi. Ajanta Ellora, I've only visited as a child, so I have to go back. It's on my bucket list. But I'm sure, Ajanta Ellora is the mother of all these art forms, right? Starts from 2nd century BC.
Alchi is still a very living place. I've seen, people are meditating there from all over the world, not really from India, but many French people we saw, they're meditating over there. It's a very living thing.
No, that is true. That is very much true for much of Ladakh. Tibet, they have damaged it, but when I went, the monasteries were desolate and...
Lama Yaru also another great monastery.
Lama Yaru is a beautiful monastery. Yes, I've seen the mass dances there. I did a night hall there, in fact. And it's a fantastic place. Lama Yaru, then of course Hemes is there, and Likher, and these monasteries are there. Absolutely.
And that lovely image of Buddha you showed on the road from Kargil to Leh, it's just spectacular. Yes, spectacular.
Yes.
Suddenly you see...
Very little of that is still to be seen in India. So there must have been a time when this was profuse and found in much larger sizes and all over, like Bamiyan, and even Peshawar was Purushavar, and Kanishka's time and all these times. So the idea behind the book is to sort of go back in time and peep into that ancient India. And this was in India where 25% of world GDP was coming from us. This was in India where Aryabhatta, Sushruta Charak, all kinds of advances in science, technology, philosophy, religion were happening. Anyways.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So, there is a request from some people to have it again. But I think we'll wait for a physical one rather than a virtual one. I think that will be far more interesting. And we will try and organize it that way. So we had, as I told you, people from all over the country, all over the world. We had a couple of... So nice. And thank you very much for the time. And let's see, we will maybe organize something else once you give us some idea.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.